You know, this is such an indulgence to be able to talk about myself, which I don't think I've ever done in my life like this. But anyway, it's such an indulgence that I may as well just continue this indulgence, and go from my strawberry shortcake to a nice, dark chocolate cake, and continue. But I mean, I think one thing that can be said about at this juncture and in a career, perhaps, is that this period of time over which I've been involved in anthropology and development has bridged massive changes in the structure of the globe and the things that the world or the international community can do to address many of the problems that we confront. And it's been very interesting to be working on projects that, as you work on them, new solutions, new conundrums appear. Let me talk a little bit about China and then maybe go back to Africa to say some things about that. I know China, for development people or anybody who hasn't worked in China, you haven't seen you haven't seen what an efficient machine that place is, and it's very remarkable. But one of the things that, as I've said many times, that I proposed to the Chinese and that we did, along with the Canadian government, was that we were very much involved in a project, any kind of project that would make increase the access to the everyday citizen, to farmers in Western China, to transporters, to everybody, make funds available for if they had some ideas of taking any initiative. and so part of the study in China was the first level was to do an assessment of a big program that the Canadians had done to increase the microfinance. But of course, China never does things halfway, so they did. Microfinance was increased, but not like Muhammad Yunus. This is not what we're talking about. This is not little lending clubs, micro lending clubs. This is billions of dollars through the Chinese Bank of Agricultural Development being spread, but done well. And so we were able to find ways in which we could make it work a little bit more efficiently. And one of the ways that we did that was to show how effective it was, to show how very, very unlike the way in which the project in northern Pakistan was done. This project was done carefully. Funds, it was made sure that everybody, there were very few impediments to people having access to things. If they wanted to do something innovative, they could do it. Money was available. China made it available. As many people know, and we began the work there in 2002, 2003. As many people know, by 2012, 10 years later, the poverty problem in China was largely solved. We maintained an interest in it over a couple of years and continued to make. What was intriguing was that the Chinese government loved our report. So it looked very good on Canada and on my company. So that was lots of fun. But they then called us and asked us to provide ongoing consultancy services to the what they call the Ministry of Poverty, which is basically the Ministry of the Western Provinces, dealing with ways in which they could increase their well-being. And we said, fine, I'm ready. That's a great idea. So, and of course, Canada was delighted. And what was very interesting was that all of us were geared up to do that, and then something happened. And it's this something which has taught me that things are changing very, very rapidly. And that something was that the Chinese made 2 offers to buy Canadian companies. One was Noranda, I'm sure you know Noranda Mines, and then the other was Husky. And they never got them. They didn't get them, but they wanted to buy them. And the Canadian Parliament, of course, said to itself, why are we giving aid to a country that wants to buy our most precious corporations? Well, that's the lesson. And it's an important lesson that I have learned, is that the world is changing extremely rapidly. Globalization is taking things in directions that you really need to be very clever to be able to keep up with. And you need to see, because at a time in a decade when one solution is good, then a decade later, it isn't going to be there. And one of the very promising and interesting things is how problems that arise, and that's what I had to say about China. It was a very unusual experience, but is that how problems arise in Central Africa in particular, and we'll come back to Rwanda. All of a sudden, that we're largely intractable, like the problem of the war in Congo between 1996 after the overthrow of Mobutu and then coming into power of Kabila and so on and so on and so on. And then the war that came about as a result of Rwanda and Uganda's involvement and stuff like that. How it went on and on, but as time went on, some new solutions have now come up. And I want to talk about that are not conventional ones. I mentioned a minute ago that I was concerned about 3 things in development that I think are paramount. One is security, some kind of security, policing, protection against conflict, and protecting the individual against humanitarian acts. Secondly is the public service. And I mentioned a couple of things about how critical that is. And in that is, of course, the decentralization, devolution of powers from the states so that, and I think that's the second thing. The third thing that I think is very important, and in the context of what I now want to say, is justice. And I think traditionally nobody would have given much credence to investing in either national courts or international courts, because the law is, for many people, and probably quite properly so, as inefficient and as unpredictable and maybe even as corrupt as the countries and the people and the politicians that you're trying to help in the first place. But it has become a cornerstone of the development of global governance. And for that reason, I've taken a very, very very strong interest in it. And I see, let me come back to Rwanda. We were talking about how does my early work in Rwanda on the protests, on the margins of the kingdom, now the kingdom, that was many, I guess you can say that was many years ago, but it's of a different era. And what has happened since then, and how have things changed, and how do I respond to that? Well, the Tutsis, of course, had been overthrown. That was in the early days of the reign of the Hutus and the rise of Habyarimana, and so on and so on and so on. And over that time, the Tutsis, of course, disappeared as refugees into Uganda, most notably in Canada, raised money, and came back in 1994, of course, to overthrow the Hutu government in a violent spasm of hatred and fury, and it produced what some people call the genocide. And the genocide, I take issue with that idea. I say this with some trepidation because I'm not so sure it will be well received, but it was a coup. Kagame overthrew the Hutu government. And I've worked there many times since then. I've worked there for the United Nations. I worked there in many cases because of deep concern about the things that Kagame is doing. Many people love him, but one has to be extremely cautious because the tension, because what he has done, as has done Nkurunziza in Burundi, as is doing Kabila, as has done Museveni, and as would be done by Bashir if he could, probably has been done, or even Kenyatta in Kenya, what is happening is that Kagame is restoring the ancient kingdom. And with the restoration of that ancient kingdom, the same old injustices, the same old inequities, and the same old vulnerabilities and dangers to the world that we saw. For example, one of the things that Kagame has done is he's been the main instigator of the war in the Congo, because he wants to steal the minerals. Which is one of the reasons why the minerals extraction, our attempt to regulate the flow of minerals is so important, but because he wants to steal the minerals, but also because he wants power. He wants to take over the Congo, and he will be a vicious implementer of very bad justice. So I've been very intrigued. I've been very intrigued with what's happened in the Congo, and because of my involvement in the Congo, and my involvement with Rwanda and watching how things have changed, so I've taken a particularly strong interest in justice. Not only justice in Rwanda and the Gacaca courts, of course, which I think were a qualified success, but most particularly in the success of the ad hoc tribunals. The International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda and the International Criminal Tribunal for Yugoslavia. And I'll tell you, and I want to say why. Because one of the things, because really to control this dead weight on development that conflict is, that divides people and that makes things difficult for people, the one way to control that is by threatening some mechanism of deterrence, is by making sure that people know that if they're going to be held accountable for it, who's going to do it? How are they going to be held accountable? What can you do about that? So that has been one of my most abiding interests. And it goes all the way back to my interest in international law that I took up at Johns Hopkins. So it's kind of a very interesting full circle. So when I was doing the work for the Secretary General in the Congo, I found myself in the northern eastern part of the Congo, a place called Ituri, where I happened to get caught in the crossfire of a lot of young kids with rifles and who were shooting at me, and I will never forget it. It was a very traumatic experience. And but I mean, they weren't shooting at me personally, but they were, but I was in the midst of this crossfire with RPGs and things like that. It was really unpleasant. And they were all under the authority of a guy named Thomas Lubanga. What was interesting about this Thomas Lubanga is that he became, let me go back just a step. So you know about the International Criminal Court, right, at The Hague. It got started in a remarkably dramatic way in 2002 and has developed in fits and starts, but it is a court, and with lots and lots of global support. And the very first trial of this International Criminal Court was the defendant was Thomas Lubanga, the guy with whom I had this very unpleasant experience. Personally, I was very much caught up in it. So after finishing the Sissebu book, the book on Nova Scotia that I described to you, I began to write a book on this first trial. And I've just finished it. And I am expecting it to come out at the University of Toronto Press. And the interesting thing about this work, and I know you're trying to track a person's work, but it's more like just it's an important phenomenon as well globally. The interesting thing about this work is that it shows that, as things have evolved, so there have emerged international solutions to local problems, whereas before we did not have recourse to that. And I'm a great advocate of the International Criminal Court. And my book is an attempt to show, first of all, the failings. It's actually written like a novel. like a trial story. It's like the Eichmann trials. It's written in the same Hannah Arendt kind of style. Not as smart as Hannah Arendt, but it's a trial story. But in the story, and it's literary, but at the same time in the story, it really tries to address the question of what about this court? Is it the beginning, one of the first major institutions in global order and global government? It is. And how effective can it be? Thomas Lubanga was convicted. Many of the rebels in the eastern Congo then took flight. Even the worst of them, a guy named Bosco Ntaganda, turned himself over to the American embassy in Kigali because he realized if Thomas Lubanga was going to get caught and convicted, he too would be caught and convicted. He is now being held into trial. They're all in prison. Many of these guys are in prison. Some of them got off. It's a messy situation. The first years of the International Criminal Court are not good. But I felt that this was where I thought I should, give my attention. The world had changed. The world has changed. And I think anthropology needs to change with it. But I think one of the things that's most interesting, and really intriguing, is that for the first time, there needs to be a new perspective on how to deal with, global poverty, with global inequities in particular, and conflict, and criminality. And one way is to label it as criminal, and to hold people accountable, to take them to court. Those people who bear upon others inequitably, who transgress and who deprive others of their livelihood, are now, we might say, well, we've got to have motivational talks, or maybe some anthropologists say, well, now we've got to have some kind of, lending clubs and microfinance organizations and stuff like that. Now we can actually talk about, an international court that will bring these guys to trial. So this has been really a great fun. I mean, this last book is really quite a fun. It's called Disorder in the Court, because it doesn't. I'm not taking the messiness of the court. I'm not going to give them any break. I mean, it tells all the dirty stories of what happened in the trial, but at the same time, I think its ultimate purpose is to show that there are new ideas out there. The world has changed. And now it's time to think about something completely different, which takes anthropology in a very different direction. So I'll close on that. I mean, I do expect to continue with, development and with concern with world orders and with development issues, and particularly with growth and inequities. But I think I'm going to I've now taken a bit of a different turn, particularly with this latest book. This is an opportunity to to say things both about utility and about things that go way beyond utility, really. But I mean, its usefulness to the world, but and I'll say a word about that. But its usefulness to me, personally, and they're both really very serious. I would have to confess, in a humble way. It's been very. I didn't realize it until somewhat recently how important the study of anthropology had been to me. All these years, from my undergraduate education to particularly was studying about Lévi-Strauss and these great guys, and then carrying on all these years. I mean, it's been first thing, utility to the world. I continue to insist that let's make a distinction between macro and micro views of the world. I mean, because anthropology is superb at micro examinations. And it's not because of any particular technique, but because of an inclination that it provides the researcher to have a close look at everything, its colors, its shapes, its angles, its insides and its outsides. And sometimes you think, well, God, I'm going to be looking at the trade goods of the islanders, here and there, and oh well, they've got these little these little silly little necklaces. But that's the beauty of that is not only that it opens up a line of communication that really allows people to interact with each other, but also because those are the terms of understanding. That's the terms of understanding that the people with whom you're interacting have for themselves, and they must be the terms of understanding that the people that, if you want to interact with them, you have to have as well. So I mean, to be part of that and to participate in that way with them on a number of occasions, as I've done, in many different places, I think that's one of the best trainings in understanding stuff. I'm very grateful about that. It's just, and not only that, but it's fun. And I think a lot of anthropologists and a lot of the people that we've talked about in my department and in your department, certainly the departments that Emmanuel and Anthony are going to be in, I mean, I think that's something that they all appreciate. As you were mentioning, the problem of whaling on Baffin Island. I mean, got to have a close-up look at that, because the answers are never obvious. So you need the details. So I think that's one thing. And I always felt, I mean, I that when you're looking at something, and this is great fun to be to be a writer and an anthropologist. So when you look at something, even let's take the International Criminal Court. I mean, it's important to look at not just the transactions that they go through, or to read the Rome Statute and the regulations, or the crimes that over which they have jurisdiction, or the obligations of states, or the way that take a look at the shape of the courtroom. Take a look at the dress that the judges wear. Take a look at the way that they interact inside the courtroom. Take a look, or think about what conditions the adversarial interaction between the defense and the prosecution. Now, those are things that an anthropologist would ask, and they're not things that lawyers ever ask. Let me assure you, I know from experience, and they're absolutely essential to understanding the court. And so, I mean, they're not the only thing, not by any means, but they are essential. They are the sine qua non of understanding how the court operates. And I think that's a very interesting thing that I've learned over the years, that pay attention to the details and to the people. And I come back to the idea that I always felt was essential, was to make sure that you get down to the local level, always, and stay there. And that comes from the discipline. But I think when many anthropologists come to write what they have to say, they get caught in an academic syndrome which dries up the color that they had the ultimate opportunity to have access to. And I don't like that. I've never liked it. I've read many monographs, and I find them to be soporific in the extreme. Soporific, by the way, means makes you go to sleep. So, and so that part of, I mean, to take the gift that anthropology gives to inquirers, and to dry it up on the line and completely destroy it is, to me, a bit of a... I'm sure it has its role. I'm sure academic writing and discourse has its role. And I don't want to be critical of anybody who does it. But I have always felt that there was a very solid alternative. And that solid alternative is for me to become a voice for the things that I just described, for the details, for the colors, and let the story itself and the interactions and the micro view carry the message, the anthropological message. And I've done that. And to be perfectly honest, I love it. I find it so intriguing to try to convey a complex circumstance in a literary and colorful way, and in a way that does two things: conveys what's really going on that nobody else would see, and engages the reader in the story so completely that the reader will not fall asleep, that the reader will carry on to the next page, and the next page, and the next page, in a kind of a momentum of interest. That's what's lacking in a lot of anthropological discourse. It was always for me. So that's what I practiced. I mean, that's what drew me to try to become a good writer. It's been a very interesting experience because, you know, a lot of times, particularly in the consultancies, you know, you write the reports and they say, "Wow, it's very colorful," or something like that. Well, no, it's just well written. You know, it's like you don't have to give up the logic, but you can bring in a capacity or a link to how it can be, to a feeling about it, as well as to a deep understanding. Well, now I've just finished a kind of a quasi nonfiction piece on the court, so I'm now going to do a novel, and I look forward to it a great deal because I think, although the novel is going to tell, it's going to be about the political struggles in the Congo and how it's related and how it involves all kinds of global things, the migration of Sephardic Jews from the Isle of Rhodes to the catching of fish in Lake Moero and in and around the Luapula River, and to the mining ventures in Katanga and stuff like that. All it's going to include, I hope it's going to be a dramatic rendering. And I've always felt, and as you mentioned, Bernard Arcon, Carlos Castaneda, and so on, and we could name them. They're around. There are a lot of them around, and they're so good. Some anthropologists. It just skipped my mind. This marvelous Indian anthropologist who's written so well on the Glass Palace and so on. But there are many of them, and I think they do a great service to the discipline. Far more service than I'll ever do, but at least I do love it, and I'm going to follow in their footsteps. The issue of literature and anthropology is not that deep. It's just a wonderful thing to do, and it gives it a color and a hue and a perspective and a zip that otherwise it wouldn't have. There we are.